Listen, if you've ever been handed back to the world like a coat that didn't fit, you'll understand this story in your bones before I finish the first page. The rest of you will have to take it slow. I've buried 2 dogs, one wife, and a brother I never forgave. And I'm telling you, the saddest thing I ever watched wasn't any of them going into the ground. It was a woman standing at the edge of my property at dusk, holding a carpet bag with both hands the way a child holds something they expect to be taken, asking me, not for shelter, not for food, but asking me whether a person could be worth keeping if they couldn't give anybody anything. I didn't have an answer that night. I'm not sure I have a clean one now, but I have the whole of what happened, and I've learned that the truth, told straight, is its own kind of answer. So sit, pour something if you've got it. This is the story of Maren Cole, the woman a whole town decided was broken, and what it cost both of us to prove a town wrong. The dust came up the road before she did. That's the first thing, the dust. It was the dry end of August in the territory, the kind of dry that makes the cattle stupid and the men short-tempered, and I was out by the south fence with a fistful of staples in my teeth and a hammer I'd been meaning to rehandle for 2 years. I saw the dust and figured it for a rider. We didn't get many. The Mercer place was 11 miles east, and the nearest town, Cottonwood Bend, was a half day if you didn't push your horse, and nobody came 11 miles in August unless somebody was dying or somebody owed money. It wasn't a rider, it was a woman walking. I want to be honest about myself here, because if I dress this up you won't believe the rest of it. My first thought wasn't kindness. My first thought was, Lord, what now? The same thought I have about a snapped cinch or a coyote in the henhouse. I was 58 years old that summer, and I had built my whole life around the idea that I was finished being surprised by people. I'd put my wife Alina in the ground 6 years before. I talked more to my horse than to any human, and the horse, a sour gray gelding named Pewter, talked back about as much as I deserved. I kept a ledger in the house where I wrote down the price of feed and the date the well got cleaned, and sometimes late, things I had no business writing. That the light came different through the kitchen window in October than it did in March, that I dreamed of Alina's hands and woke up reaching. Foolish things. I never showed anyone the ledger. I'm only telling you now because the woman walking up my road ended up in it, and after a while she took up more pages than the cattle did. She stopped maybe 40 feet off, close enough I could see she'd been walking a long time. Her hem was gray with dust to the knee, and one of her shoes had come apart at the toe and been bound back together with a strip of cloth. She had a carpet bag in both hands, held in front of her, and a face that had decided not to ask for anything before her mouth could betray her. "Mister," she said, her voice was steadier than I expected, "I'm not begging." "All right," I said, around the staples. I took them out of my teeth, felt suddenly rude standing there with hardware in my mouth like a fool. "All right, nobody said you were. I can work, I can cook, I can mend, I can keep books if you've got them, I can pull a calf. I'm not afraid of any of it." She said this fast, like a recitation she'd practiced on the road so it wouldn't shake when it counted. "I don't need much. A corner, wages if you can. No wages if you can't for a while till I prove out." I looked at her. The sun was going down behind her, so I had to squint, and the squinting probably read as suspicion, which it wasn't, or wasn't only. "Where'd you walk from?" A pause, the smallest thing crossed her face, a flinch she caught and pinned down before it could spread. "Cottonwood Bend." "That's a half day on a horse." "I didn't have a horse." "You walked since when?" "This morning, early." She shifted the bag, her knuckles were white on the handles, "before light." So she'd walked the better part of a day in August heat with a busted shoe, and she was standing in front of a stranger's fence asking for a corner and no wages, and trying to make it sound like a fair trade for the privilege. I have met proud men who would not have done that to save their own skin. Something in my chest, some old rusted thing I thought had seized up for good after Alina, gave a turn. "What's your name?" "Maren Cole." Then, because she was honest even when honesty cost her, I'd learned that about her, she added. It used to be Marin Mercer. That landed. Mercer. Caleb Mercer ran the big spread to the east, 400 head and a house with 2 stories and a wife who died young. I'd heard of fever. I'd met Caleb twice and disliked him both times, a man who shook your hand while looking past you to see if there was somebody more worth shaking. Used to be Mercer. Which meant the dead young wife maybe wasn't dead. Which meant something had come apart out there that I didn't know about and probably didn't want to. You're Caleb Mercer's wife, I said. I was. He throw you out. And here is where I watched Marin Cole do the thing she would do 100 times in the months I knew her, square up to a hard truth instead of ducking it. She lifted her chin. Not proud, exactly. More like a woman bracing to take a blow she'd taken before and knew the shape of. He had it annulled, she said. Said the marriage was never real because I never gave him a child. He had a paper drawn up. The Reverend signed it. The judge and the Ben signed it. They all signed it. Her voice didn't break, but it went very flat, the way water goes flat right before it goes over a falls. 4 years married, and they wrote it down that none of it ever happened because my body wouldn't do the one thing they wanted from it. She stopped, made herself stop. So no, mister. He didn't throw me out. According to the paper, there was never anybody to throw out. I have thought about that moment more than I've thought about almost anything in my life. A man my age, you'd figure he's done having his understanding of things rearranged. But I stood there in the dying light with my rehandled hammer I never did rehandle, and I felt the whole shape of the world tilt a half-degree, the way it does when you learn cruelty has a paperwork to it. That they'd written it down. That a reverend and a judge had put their names to the lie that a woman's 4 years of waking up beside a man and cooking his food and burying. I'd find out later, burying 3 bobbies that came too soon, that none of it had been real because the 4th one never came at all. Get up to the house, I said. It came out rougher than I meant. There's water on the porch. I'll be along. She didn't move. I meant what I said. I'll work. I'm not asking for charity. I heard you the first time, Mrs. Cole. I picked my hammer back up because my hands needed something to do. I've got a porch, a pump, and a heel of bread that's going stale either way. You can pay me back by not making me say it twice. Something happened in her face then that I won't try too hard to describe because the trying would ruin it. It was relief, and it was shame at needing the relief, and it was suspicion that the relief would be snatched back. All 3 at once, and under all of it something older and more tired than any of them. She nodded. She picked up her bag. She'd set it down sometime in the talking. I hadn't noticed, and she walked up toward the house, and her busted shoe made a small uneven sound in the dust, slap and scuff, all the way up the rise. Pewter came over to the fence and put his big stupid head against my shoulder. Don't look at me like that, I told him. I didn't have a choice. He blew air through his lips. He knew a lie when he heard one, and so did I. I'd had a choice. I'd had every choice in the world. I just made the one I could live with. That first night she barely ate. I put the bread out and some cold beans and the last of a ham that was past its best, and I made coffee because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and I watched her eat like a person who has trained herself not to want things. Small bites. Long pauses, eyes on the door the whole time like she expected somebody to come through it and tell her the meal was a mistake. She'd washed her face and hands at the pump, and the dust line at her wrists was sharp where she'd stopped, and her hair, which I'd taken for plain brown, turned out to have a deal of red in it when it wasn't full of road. You can have Alina's room, I said. My late wife, it's clean. Nobody's been in it but to dust. The porch is fine. The porch has scorpions in August. I'm not afraid of scorpions. I am, I said, which was true and which got the very smallest sound out of her, not a laugh, but the place a laugh comes from, a little exhale through the nose. First crack in the ice. I filed it away. I'm a patient man with cattle, and I figured people couldn't be that different. Why are you doing this? She asked. She put her fork down. She looked straight at me, and I understood that this was the question she'd been carrying the whole 11 miles, heavier than the carpet bag. You don't know me. For all you know, I'm exactly what they say I am. Bad luck. Broken. A woman who can't do the thing a woman's for. The words came out of her like she was reading them off a sign she'd been forced to wear. Caleb's mother used to say it to my face. You're a fine pot with no fire in it. Like I was a stove that wouldn't light. Everybody in that town looked at me like a stove that wouldn't light. She picked the fork back up, set it down again. So why would you take in a stove that won't light, mister? What do you want? Now I could have said something soft. I've thought of all the soft things I might have said. But I'd been alone 6 years and I'd lost the trick of softness. And besides, I had a feeling soft was exactly what she didn't trust, having had it used on her as bait before. So I gave her the truth plain, the way you'd hand somebody a tool. My wife and I never had children either, I said. The room got quiet in a different way. Couldn't we tried a long time, then we stopped trying and just lived. I turned my coffee cup around on the table a quarter turn, a habit Alina used to swat my hand for. Town was different than yours, I guess. Or maybe we just had less town to deal with way out here, but I know the look people give you, like you're a field that came up empty and they're trying to figure out whose fault the planting was. I looked up at her. Nobody wrote it on a paper for us. But they wrote it on their faces every Sunday for 30 years. So when you tell me they called you a stove that won't light, I don't need it explained. I've been the field. She didn't say anything. Her eyes had gone bright, and she was holding very still the way you hold still, when moving even a little would tip something over. That's the whole of why, I said. It's not goodness. Don't go thinking it's goodness. I'm a selfish old man who's been lonesome and bitter for 6 years, and you walked up my road being treated worse than I ever was, and something in me wanted to even a score that's got nothing to do with you. There. That's the ugly truth, and you can have it. Now eat your beans before they're cold and not just cold. She ate her beans, and somewhere in the middle of them she started to cry, not loud, just water running down a still face, and she kept eating right through it like she'd be damned if she'd waste the food. And I got up and went out to check on a horse that didn't need checking, because a person crying like that has earned the dignity of doing it without an audience. I stood on the porch in the dark and listened to the chink of her fork against the plate, slowing, and the cicadas going in the brush. And I thought, Eli Ransom, you old fool, you have let something into your house that is going to break your heart. I was right, just not the way I thought. She proved out faster than any hand I ever hired. By the end of the first week, she'd found the soft rot in my pantry shelving that I'd been ignoring and propped it before it dumped a winter's flower on the floor. She had Alina's old garden turned and replanted, late in the season as it was, talking to it under her breath the way I talked to pewter. She found my ledger. I'd left it out, careless. And she didn't pry, just set it square in the middle of the table where I'd know she'd seen it and trusted me to know she hadn't read past the numbers. That was a kind of grace I hadn't met before, the grace of leaving a man his privacy in his own house. She didn't talk about the Mercers. I didn't ask. But the story came up out of the ground the way water does when you've dug close to it in pieces, sideways, when she wasn't expecting to tell it. The 3 bobbies came out one evening over the mending. She was darning my socks over my objection. I can darn my own socks. I'd been doing it 6 years, but she said idle hands made her think too much, and so I let her, and she said to the sock and not to me, the first one I lost in the spring. Caleb planted a peach tree where we buried it. He was kind that year. A pause, the needle going. The second one his mother said it was something I ate. The third one she stopped pretending it was anything but me. The needle stopped. After the third one Caleb didn't come to the burying. He sent the foreman. I didn't say anything. I'd learned that with her, silence was a room she could put things in, and if I filled it with talk, she'd have nowhere to set the heavy thing down. They have a name for it now, she said. The doctor in Prescott, he had a long word. He said my body, she stopped, started over plainer. He said it wasn't anything I did, wasn't a thing I ate or a sin I committed or a prayer I forgot. He said some bodies just can't hold on, and it isn't a fault, it's a weather, like hail. You don't blame a field for the hail. She laughed, but it was the bad kind. I rode home so happy. 3 days on a wagon, and I was happy the whole way because I had a word for it, and the word said it wasn't my fault. I came in the door already talking. I told Caleb. I told his mother. And his mother said the doctor was a stranger who'd never have to live with the empty cradle, so what did he know? She set the sock down in her lap. Her hands were very still on it. And Caleb said, her voice did the flat thing, the water before the falls thing. Caleb said a word from a doctor in Prescott didn't change what a wife was for. That a field that won't grow is a field that won't grow, and you don't keep paying taxes on barren ground. I had to get up. I'm not ashamed to say it. I had to get up and go to the window and stand with my back to her because I have a temper I keep on a short rope, and it had got loose, and I didn't want her to see it and think for 1 second it was pointed anywhere near her. You don't keep paying taxes on barren ground. He'd said that to a woman who'd buried 3 of his children. He'd said it, and then he'd gone to a judge and a reverend and had them write down that she'd never existed at all. Mr. Ransom. I'm all right, I said to the glass. The Mercer place was out there past the dark, 11 miles east, and I imagined for 1 ugly minute riding out there with the rope and the hammer and evening a score the loud way. Then it passed the way the worst of it always does, leaving just the tiredness. I turned around. I'm all right, I rubbed my face. I knew Caleb Mercer was a small man. I didn't know he was that small. Takes a special kind of small to take a thing that's already a grief, and find the angle to make it shameful too. She was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her yet. It took me a second to place it, and when I did it near about undid me. She looked surprised that I was angry on her account, surprised that anybody would be. As though in all those years out east, with the paper and the reverend and the mother and the looks every Sunday, not one living soul had stood at a window with their back turned shaking with rage that this had been done to her. And the simple fact of someone doing it now, 6 years a widower and no kin to her at all, was a stranger thing to Marin Cole than any cruelty. That's the part I can't get past, even now. Not that the world was cruel to her. The world is cruel to most everybody, sooner or later, in its turn. It's that cruelty had become so ordinary to her that plain decency looked like a miracle. You don't have to be, she said quietly. Angry on my account, I've made my peace. No, you haven't, I said. You've made a truce, there's a difference, I've lived in both. A truce is just a warrior too tired to keep fighting. I sat back down, picked up my own sock and the spare needle because the room needed the small, ordinary sound of 2 people mending and not the big, terrible thing we dug up. Pass me the gray thread. She passed me the gray thread. Her hand was steadier than mine, and we sat there, the 2 of us, mending socks in the lamplight, 2 empty fields the world had given up on, and for the length of that evening neither of us was lonesome, and neither of us said so, because saying so would have been more than the truce could bear. I should tell you the trouble was already coming. It came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks in the shape of a rider. A real one this time, a young hand off the Mercer place named Tully, who I knew a little and didn't think much of either way. He came up the road easy and tipped his hat and asked, polite as church, whether I had a woman staying on. I said I had a hired hand, which was true, and asked what business it was of his. He looked uncomfortable, to his credit. Mr. Mercer sent me to say, he started and stopped and started again. Mr. Mercer's marrying again, the Holly's girl from the Bend, weddings in October. He shifted in the saddle. He wanted it known, around, that Mrs. Cole's situation is settled and done legal, and he'd take it unkind if anybody was to, he couldn't find the word. Was to what, I said. Was to make trouble about it by taking her in, making it look like she was wronged. Tully wouldn't meet my eye now. He says it reflects poor on the family, having her took in by a neighbor like a stray. He says he'd consider it a hostile act, Mr. Ransom. I have ranched this valley 40 years. I have stood off a bank, 2 droughts, a range war that didn't quite catch, and a winter that killed half my herd. I know a threat when one rides up my road wearing another man's hat. And I'll tell you what I felt standing there wasn't fear. It was something I hadn't felt in 6 years, since before Alina went into the ground and took my reasons with her. I felt useful. You tell Caleb Mercer, I said slow, so Tully would carry it word for word, that I've got a hired hand who pulls calves and keeps my books and darns a better sock than any man in this territory. And her name's Marin Cole, and she's not a stray and she's not a situation and she's not done. You tell him she's the best worker I ever hired and the bravest person I ever met. And if he thinks me saying so out loud is a hostile act, then he's right, it is. And there's plenty more where it came from. You tell him that. Tully swallowed. He looked for just a second like a young man who'd rather work for somebody else. Yes, sir, he said, and he turned his horse and rode back east into the heat. I stood and watched the dust of him go. And when I turned around, Marin was on the porch. She'd heard the whole of it. She was holding a dish towel in both hands the way she'd held the carpet bag that first night, braced for the thing to be taken away. You shouldn't have, she said. Her voice was shaking now in a way it hadn't on the road, in a way it hadn't even over the 3 bobbies. Mr. Ransom, you don't know him. You don't know what you've got a whole life here, 40 years. And you just, for me, you just. I know exactly what I just did, I said. What I didn't know, what neither of us knew, standing on that porch in the long gold light with the dust settling east, was what it was going to cost, or who was going to do the paying. Caleb Mercer didn't come at me the way a brave man would, straight up the road with his complaint in his mouth. He came at me the way small men come at you, through the things you need to live. The water went first. There's a creek runs down out of the North Hills, the Agua Fria feeder we just called the Cold Branch, and it crosses Mercer ground before it crosses mine. Always had. For 40 years that was no kind of problem, because water that crosses your land and keeps going isn't yours to keep. That's territory law and it's older than any of us. But Caleb had money and money buys lawyers, and that September a man I'd never met rode up from Prescott with a paper. The Mercers loved a paper that said Caleb had filed for the full prior appropriation of the Cold Branch, every drop, for stock and irrigation, and that any flow reaching my land downstream was a courtesy he was now withdrawing. He damned it on a Thursday. By Saturday my lower tank was mud and my cattle were standing at the edge of it lowing in a way that gets into your teeth. He can't do that, Marin said. She got the books out and the territory water statute that I didn't even know I owned, some pamphlet of Alina's, and she was reading it by lamp with her finger going line by line. 3 weeks on the place and she knew my affairs better than I did. It says here downstream users with prior beneficial use, Mr. Ransom, you've watered cattle off that branch for 40 years. That's prior. That's the oldest right there is. He can't just damn it because he filed a paper last month. He can damn it, I said, and I can't undamn it without a lawyer I can't afford, and by the time a judge sorts it out my herd's dead of thirst. That's the whole game. He doesn't have to be right. He just has to be slow and rich enough to be slow longer than I can be thirsty. She was quiet a long moment. Then she said the thing I'd been refusing to say to myself. He's doing it because of me. He's doing it because he's the kind of man who'd dam a creek. He left that creek alone for 40 years, you said it yourself. She closed the book. Her face had gone hard and still, the fall's face. He's doing it because of me, and you know it, and I'm not going to sit at your table and eat food you can't water your stock to grow while you lose your whole life pretending it's about a creek. She stood up. I'll go in the morning. If I'm gone he's got no reason, he'll open the dam, you'll be. Sit down. Mr. Ransom. Marin, I'd never used her front name. It stopped her like a hand on the shoulder. Sit down, please. She sat slow, wary. If you walk out that door in the morning to save my creek, I said, then he's won the only thing he was ever really after, which isn't water. It's the lesson. You understand. He wants it written down, not on paper this time, on the whole valley, that a woman like you is a thing that brings ruin wherever she lights, and the proof will be that you ran off to keep from ruining me. He'd open the dam, sure. And he'd tell the story at every wedding and funeral for 20 years. Took her in and lost his water, smart man saw sense. She moved on like the bad weather she is. I leaned across the table. That's the version where he wins. I'd rather lose the herd than hand him that version. And I mean that with my whole heart, and I've never meant anything more. And if you walk out that door to spare me, I will follow you down the road in my nightshirt hollering so the whole territory knows you didn't leave because you brought ruin. You left because a good man asked you to stay, and you were too kind to make him fight for you. Now which story do you want told? She looked at me for a long time. The lamp guttered. Somewhere out in the dark the cattle were still lowing at the mud. "You're a stubborn old fool," she said finally. Her voice had gone thick. "I am the most stubborn fool in this territory," I agreed. "It's the only thing I'm genuinely the best at. Now, we're not going to lose the herd. We're going to drive them up to the high seep on the north quarter where Caleb's paper doesn't reach, and we're going to do it tomorrow before it gets any worse, and you're going to help me because you can pull a calf and I've got a bad hip. Are we agreed?" We were agreed. The high seep was a 6-mile push over broken ground, and it should have taken 3 of us and didn't have 3 of us. It had me and my bad hip and Marin Cole, who had never driven cattle in her life, and learned it in a single brutal day the way she learned everything. By doing it wrong twice and right the third time, and never the same way wrong twice. I wish I could tell you it went smooth. It did not go smooth. We lost a heifer in a wash when she bolted, and Marin went in after her against my hollering and came out filthy and bleeding from a forearm where the brush had got her, dragging that heifer by a rope with both hands and a fury on her face I'd not seen before. She'd been so contained all those weeks, so careful. And here she was screaming at a cow in the bottom of a wash, screaming at it like the cow was Caleb Mercer and the Reverend and the mother and the whole town of Cottonwood Bend, all wearing one stupid bovine face. You will not give them another thing to take. Get up." And the heifer got up. Came up out of that wash like the word of God himself had reached down. And Marin stood there shaking, arms streaming red, and looked at me, and we both started laughing. The terrible, exhausted laughing you do when the other choice is weeping, and you've run dry of the water for it. "You're bleeding," I said. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. It's halfway to the bone, let me." "It is nothing," she said, and she meant it, and I understood she meant something bigger than the arm. She'd spent 4 years being told that the deepest hurt a person can carry was no excuse to stop performing wifehood. She had a high tolerance now for telling pain to wait. It wasn't healthy. But by God it was useful on a cattle drive, and I'd be a liar to say I didn't lean on it. We got them to the seep by dark. Both of us could barely sit a horse, and the cattle put their heads down to the water and drank, and the sound of 40 thirsty animals finally drinking is a sound I will hear on my deathbed, I think, the deep grateful working of it, and Marin and I sat our horses side by side and watched, too tired to speak, and the moon came up over the North Hills white as a clean bone. "My mother died when I was 9, she said out of nowhere to the moon. "Childbed, 4th baby like me, killed her." She didn't look at me. "My father always said I had her weakness, like it was a thing she handed down to me on purpose, the weakness." She was quiet. "I used to think if I'd never been born my mother would have lived, and then I grew up and the same thing that killed her wouldn't even let me start, and I thought, well, there's the joke. There's God's whole joke on me. Too weak to be born from, too weak to bear. The only person who ever needed me out of my own body was the one it killed coming in." I had no answer to that. There isn't one, so I gave her the only true thing I had. "That heifer needed you today," I said. "She'd be dead in that wash." Marin laughed that surprised laugh. "A cow, Eli." First time she'd used my front name. We were even now. "A life's a life," I said. "You pulled it out of the dark with your 2 hands and you've got the arm to prove it. I don't know much theology, Marin, but I know that's not nothing. Whatever your father said, whatever the joke's supposed to be, you reached into the dark today and you pulled something living back out of it, and there's a word for a person who does that, and the word is not broken. She cried then, finally, the way she hadn't let herself the whole drive. And the cattle drank and the moon climbed, and I let her, and didn't go off to check a horse this time. I stayed. I'd learned that much. Sometimes the kindness isn't leaving them their privacy. Sometimes it's being a witness, so they know the grief got seen by somebody who didn't flinch. Help came from a direction I didn't expect, which is most directions at my age. There's an Apache woman keeps a place up in the North Hills, above even the high seep, where the government draw of the reservation does a strange jog and leaves a few square miles that are nobodies on the map and have been her family since before the map. Her name is Desba. The hands in the valley called her the witch up the hill, the way ignorant men name anything they don't understand and can't own. I'd traded with her for 20 years. She knew the high country water and the herbs, and once, the winter the fever took a leaner, she'd come down with a thing brewed from bark that eased a leaner's last nights more than anything the Prescott doctor sent. I never forgot it. You don't forget the person who made dying easier on someone you loved. Desba came down to the seep the second morning, because of course she knew. She knew everything that happened in those hills before the wind finished carrying it. She was old in a way I couldn't put a number to, and she looked at Marin a long time, longer than was polite by white manners, which Desba had never had any use for. "This is the one they unmarried with a paper," Desba said. Not a question. The story had got all the way up the hill. "This is Marin," I said. Desba kept looking at her, and Marin, who'd learned to brace under a stranger's stare, braced chin up Fall's face. But Desba's look wasn't the valley's look. I watched Marin realize it. It was a look that was weighing her, not finding her wanting. There's a difference, and Marin had forgotten there was, and I watched her remember. "My people don't count a woman by her children," Desba said. "We count her by what she carries. You," a nod, slight, final, like a judge's gavel coming down on the right side for once, "you carry a great deal. I can see the weight of it on you. They tried to make you set it down by telling you it was worthless, but weight is weight. A woman who carries weight is not empty. The empty ones are the men who put it on you." She turned to me. "The water." Caleb damned the cold branch. "I know where the cold branch is born," Desba said. "There is a seep above this one, higher, old. It was running before any Mercer's grandfather was a thought. It does not cross his land, it crosses mine, and mine is on no man's paper." She looked at the cattle. "I will show you. You will drive them up. The grass is thin, but it is enough until the snow, and by snow the judge will have ruled, because even your slow judges rule by snow." A pause. The ghost of something that might have been humor in a face carved out of the hills. "And when the judge rules against Mercer, he will. The law is the law even when the men are not. You will owe me. Not money. I have no use for money up here. You will owe me a season of your woman's company in the spring when I gather, because my hands are old and she carries weight and does not flinch, and I am tired of working alone." I looked at Marin. It wasn't my choice to make, and I knew it, and I'd learned not to make her choices for her. That was Caleb's sin, and I'd not borrow it. Marin looked at the old woman a long time, and something passed between them that I had no part in and didn't need a part in. Woman to woman, weight to weight, the recognition of one carrier by another. "I'd be glad to," Marin said, and her voice didn't shake at all. The water held. We drove them higher, to Desba's old seep, and the grass was thin, but it was enough, and the herd came through the worst of it gaunt but alive. And every evening Marin wrote in my ledger now, I'd handed it over, made her the keeper of it, and it had stopped being a thing full of feed prices and grief and become a thing full of feed prices, and the date the heifer calved and a small dried sprig of something Desba had given her pressed between 2 pages. The book had got fuller and lighter at the same time. I don't know how to explain that any better than to say it. But Caleb wasn't done. I should have known a small man can't stand to be slowly beaten. He needs to land one big blow he can tell a story about. The big blow came in October, the week of his wedding to the Holly's girl, which I think is no accident. I think he wanted his triumph and his cruelty in the same 7 days, so the whole valley would file them together in memory. He didn't come himself. He sent the foreman and 2 hands and a paper, naturally, a paper. And the paper this time said that the strip of road Marin had walked up that first August evening, the public road, I'd have sworn it on a Bible, ran across a corner of deeded Mercer land for a 1/4 mile, and that the Mercers were closing it, putting up a gate, which meant the only way off my place to the south, to town, to the doctor, to the rest of the living world, now ran through Caleb Mercer's locked gate at his pleasure. He was walling us in. Walling her in was the meaning of it, the message under the paper. You took her, neighbor, now you can have her. You can have her cut off from every soul in this valley. You can rot out here together, the field and the stove that won't light, and I'll tell it for 20 years. And here's where the heavy thing came, the thing I've turned over more nights than I can count. Because there was a way to break the gate, not the lock, the man. I knew a thing about Caleb Mercer. I'd known it for 15 years and kept it the way you keep a thing you hope you'll never need. There'd been a hand on the Mercer place, long back, a young fellow named Pard Willis who died in what got called a horse accident. And it wasn't a horse accident, and 3 men knew it wasn't, and one of them had told me drunk one night before he left the territory. And the short of it is that Caleb Mercer had killed a man over a card debt and dressed it as a fall, and I'd carried that knowing for 15 years like a stone in my boot. I could end him with it, ride to the territorial marshal, or just to the church on his wedding day, and lay it down in front of the Holly's family and God and everyone, and Caleb Mercer would hang or run, and either way the gate would come down and the creek would open and Marin would walk free into a valley that had watched her enemy destroyed. I could win, all the way win like he'd never have dared dream of losing. I sat up the whole night with it. I had the stone in my boot and I had the perfect throw, and I wanted to throw it more than I'd wanted anything since a leaner. And in the gray of the morning I went and found Marin in the kitchen, already up, always up before me, and I told her, all of it, Pard Willis, the card debt, the 15 years of knowing. I laid it out on the table between us like a loaded gun, and I said, I can end him today. I can take this to the church and end him, and you'll be free of all of it by sundown. But I won't do it without you knowing. Because you've had enough men make your choices in the dark, and I won't be one more. So I'm asking you, do I throw it? She was quiet a very long time. She turned my coffee cup a 1/4 turn, the way I do, the way she'd picked up without either of us noticing. If you throw it, she said slowly, you become a man who carried another man's death in his boot for 15 years and pulled it out the day it was useful to him. That's who you'd be, not the man who took me in. That man would be gone. The new one would have used a dead boy to win a fight about a gate. She looked up. Her eyes were dry and steady and ancient. Pard Willis isn't a card to play, Eli. He's a person who died and never got his justice, and his justice isn't yours, and it sure isn't mine, and the day you spend him on a gate is the day you become a little bit Caleb. Just a little, but it'd grow, it always grows. She reached across and stilled my hand on the cup. I didn't walk 11 miles to be saved by a man who'd do that. I'd rather climb the gate. I've climbed worse. I have never been so ashamed, and so grateful in the same minute of my life. Then I won't throw it, I said. You'll take it to the marshal, she said. Someday, the right way, for Pard and for that man who told you drunk and has to live with the silence. You'll give that dead boy his justice when it's his, not when it's useful. Promise me. I promise, I said, and I meant it, and I keep it still, but that's a story for the end. We climbed the gate, literally. The foreman came and put up the gate and locked it and rode off, and Marin and I walked down to it that evening and looked at it, and then she gathered her skirts and climbed over it, just like that, dropped down the other side and stood on the public road that no paper could really make private no matter what a Prescott lawyer signed, and she looked back at me through the bars, and she was, for the first time since the dust came up my road in August, grinning. Come on, old man, she said. Your hip can manage a gate. My hip can manage a gate, I said, and it could barely. And I dropped down beside her on the free side of Caleb Mercer's wall, and we stood on the road in the dusk laughing like fools. And that is the picture of her I'd keep over all the others if I could only keep one. Not the day she came. This. Marin Cole on the wrong side of a gate that was meant to cage her, grinning, free, having refused to be saved by anything but her own 2 hands and a clear conscience. I didn't know yet what was coming, the judge's ruling, the fire, the choice that would be hers and not mine, the heaviest one of all. But that night, climbing back over the gate in the dark to go home and water the stock at Desba's old seep, I thought, whatever this costs me, it was worth the cost. And I wanted on the record here before the hard part, I thought that, and I was right, and nothing that came after ever made me wrong about it. Not even what happened in November. The judge ruled the 2nd week of November, and he ruled the way Desba said he would, because the law is the law even when the men who carry it are not. A circuit judge named Halloran came through on his rounds and heard the water matter in the front room of the Cottonwood Bend Mercantile, which was the closest thing the Bend had to a court, and he listened to Caleb's Prescott lawyer talk for an hour about filings and appropriations and paper, and then he listened to Marin, not me. She'd prepared the whole of it. She stood up in a room full of people who'd watched her get unmarried, and she laid out 40 years of prior beneficial use in a voice that did not shake one time. And then Judge Halloran took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes and said the thing that ended it. He said a man could file all the paper he liked, but he could not file his way backward over 40 years of a neighbor watering cattle off a branch, and that prior use was prior use, and that the dam on the cold branch was to come down inside 10 days or the territory would come down it for him, with costs. And then, and this is the part that got told and retold in the valley for years, this is the part that outlived the water itself. Judge Halloran put his spectacles back on, looked down the length of that crowded room at Caleb Mercer, and said, dry as the August that started all this, Mr. Mercer, I've ruled on your water. I've no jurisdiction over your character, which is fortunate for you, as the penalties would be considerable. The room laughed. The whole room. The same room that had watched Marin shamed laughed at Caleb Mercer, and I watched the laugh land on him, and I understood that a judge had just done with one sentence what I'd nearly thrown away a man's death to do. He told the story right, in front of everyone, the true story, and no paper Caleb ever filed would unfile it. The dam came down. The cold branch ran again, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't ride out to the line one evening just to watch the water come back across my ground, the live silver thread of it filling the wash, and Marin rode out with me, and we sat the horses and watched the water come home, and neither of us said anything because there wasn't anything that wouldn't have been smaller than the water. The gate, by the way, stayed up. Caleb left the gate. I think he kept it as the one thing he could still control, a monument to his spite, and we kept climbing it. And after a while climbing, Caleb Mercer's gate stopped feeling like a hardship and started feeling like a small daily joke we got to have at his expense. There's a freedom in that, in making the thing meant to cage you into the punchline. Marin taught me that. Marin taught me a great many things that fall, about the difference between surviving a cruelty and defeating it, which are not the same, and the second one is mostly a matter of who's laughing. Then came the fire, and the fire taught us both something neither of us wanted to learn. It came in the 3rd week of November, dry lightning weather, the kind of freak late storm that throws fire and no rain. It started up in the North Hills and the wind brought it down fast, faster than fire has any business moving in November. And by the time we smelled it, the whole North Quarter was lit, and the wind was driving it straight at Desba's seep, where most of my herd still grazed, and straight on past that, higher, at Desba's place. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where I have to tell the truth about myself again, and the truth isn't flattering. We could save the herd or we could go for Desba. Not both. The fire was between them and us and moving, and the herd was downhill and reachable, and Desba was uphill and into the wind, and I am a rancher, and 40 years of being a rancher does a thing to a man's instincts that I'm not proud of. I turned my horse for the herd. I turned for the cattle. Because the cattle were 40 years of my life, and Desba was an old woman up a hill who'd surely seen the smoke and surely got herself out, surely. An old woman who knew that country better than the fire did, surely. Marin grabbed my rein. Eli, just my name, but the way she said it. The herd is cattle, she said. Desba is up there alone, and her hands are old, and she carries weight and does not flinch, and she will not run from her own home until it's too late. I know her. I gathered beside her. I know how she. Eli, look at me. I looked at her. The fire was in her face, orange, terrible. You told me at the seep that a life's a life, and pulling one out of the dark with your 2 hands is not nothing. Did you mean it? Or did you only mean it because it was a cow and it was easy? God forgive me, I hesitated. A whole life of being a rancher hesitated. And Marin Cole, the woman they'd unmarried with a paper, the stove that wouldn't light, the empty field, did not hesitate. She let go of my rein, and she turned her own horse uphill, into the wind, into the fire alone, because I'd hesitated, and she went. I have never moved faster in my life than I moved to follow her. The cattle, I left the cattle. I left 40 years standing in the smoke, and I drove my horse up the hill after a woman who'd already taught me everything I apparently still needed teaching about what a life is worth, and we went up into it together, the heat like a wall, the horses screaming, and we found Desba exactly where Marin said she'd be, not running. Standing in the door of her old place, watching her home burn toward her, too proud or too old or too rooted to run from it, and the fire a quarter-mile off and closing. It took both of us to get her on a horse. She fought us. She wanted to stay with the burning, and I understood it. That thing in an old soul that would rather go into the fire on its own feet than be carried out of its only place. But Marin got an arm around her and put her face right up against the old woman's face, and said something low in a language I didn't know. She had any of 3 words, and Desba stopped fighting and let herself be carried. And we got her up, and we got down that hill ahead of the fire with the heat at our backs the whole way, the 3 of us and 3 horses. Down through the smoke to the live silver water of the cold branch that Judge Halloran had given back to us, and we crossed it, and the fire reached the far bank, and the water stopped it. The water Caleb tried to take stopped the fire that would have killed all 3 of us, and there is an irony in that I have never gotten to the bottom of and have stopped trying. We lost 40 head of cattle. I want it said plainly. The choice cost me 40 head, near a third of what I'd saved through the drought, and it set me back years, and I never once regretted it, not for a single hour, because I have stood in the place where I would have left an old woman to burn to save some cows. I have stood there in my own self and felt how easy it was, and the only thing that pulled me back from being that man was a woman the world had thrown away grabbing my rein and asking me whether I'd meant the thing I said. Desba lived another 4 years up in those hills, in a place we rebuilt for her, smaller, before she died the way she wanted, on her own feet in her own door. And every spring of those 4 years Marin went up and gathered beside her, paying the debt that was never really a debt, and came back down with her hands stained and her arms scratched and something in her face that hadn't been there before. Peace, maybe. The real kind, not the truce. The thing on the far side of the truce I'd told her about that first month, that I wasn't sure either of us would ever reach. I gave her the home that November, the week after the fire, while my 40 dead cattle were still being skinned, and the smell of the burn was still in everything we owned. I want to tell it right, because the title of this whole account is that a man gave her a home, and people hear that, and they think of a roof and a bed and a porch with no scorpions, and that's not what I gave her, or it's the least of what I gave her. I rode to Prescott. Took me 2 days with the bad hip, and I had a lawyer not Caleb's kind, a plain one, an honest one named Foss who'd done a leaner's will draw up a paper. The Mercers loved a paper, and I'd hated every paper that ever crossed my road, every one of them an instrument of taking, the annulment that erased 4 years of her life, the appropriation that stole the water, the deed that closed the road. Every paper I'd ever seen had been a wall a man built to cage somebody smaller than him. So I had Foss draw a paper that was the opposite, a paper that gave. I deeded her the ranch, half then free and clear in her own name, Marin Cole, not Mercer, not Ransom, her own name, the name she'd kept when the law tried to take even that, and the other half to come to her on my death, with no string, no condition, no clause about marriage or children or anything a body's supposed to do or be or produce. Just land. Just water rights and grazing rights and a house and a barn and a sour gray gelding named Pewter, deeded to a woman a town had decided was worth nothing, made the legal owner of 40 years of a man's whole life, because the law that could unmake a marriage with a paper could by God make a home with one too, if you pointed it the right direction for once. I came home and I put the paper on the kitchen table, and I turned the coffee cup a quarter turn, and I slid it across to her the way I'd slid the loaded gun of Pard Willis's death across that same table, except this wasn't a gun. She read it. I watched her read it. I watched her read it twice, and then a third time, the way she'd read the water statute by lamplight, her finger going line by line like she didn't trust her eyes. And when she got to the bottom the third time, she set it down very carefully and put both hands flat on the table on either side of it and went absolutely still. "You can't," she said, barely a sound. "Eli, this is 40 years, this is everything you have. You can't just, I'm not your kin, I'm not your wife. I'm a hired hand who walked up your road in August. You can't give a hired hand your whole life. There's no reason." "There's every reason," I said, "and not one of them's the kind you can write on a paper, which is why I had to write the land instead." I sat down across from her. My hip was screaming from the ride and I didn't care. "You asked me that first night why I'd taken a stove that wouldn't light, and I gave you the ugly true answer that it was selfish, that I wanted to even a score, and that was true. But it stopped being the whole truth a long time ago, and I've been a coward about saying the rest, the way men my age are cowards, so I'm going to say it now, and you're going to let me get through it." She let me get through it. "You came up my road and I was a dead man," I said. "I'd been dead 6 years. Alina went in the ground and took the part of me that had a reason, and I kept ranching because cattle don't care if you're dead inside. They just want feeding. I wrote in that ledger because it was the only place I could be honest, and what I wrote was the writing of a man waiting to die and not in any particular hurry but not dreading it either. That was me. That was the whole of me in August. And then a woman walked up my road that the world had treated worse than it ever treated me, and asked me whether a person could be worth keeping if they couldn't give anybody anything. My voice did a thing then, the thing I'd watched do to her, the flat thing, the water before the falls. And Marin, I have spent 6 years being a person who couldn't give anybody anything. Alina's gone, we never had children, I've got no kin worth the name, and a brother I never forgave who's dead now too. I am exactly the thing they called you. Empty. A field that came up nothing. And nobody ever told me I was broken, because I'm a man and I've got land, and that's the only difference between us, Marin, the only one. They let a man be empty and call it independence, and they make a woman empty and call it broken. And it's the same emptiness. I've lived in it, I know." She was crying now, not the still kind, the kind that shakes. "You gave me something to give," I said. "That's what you don't see, that's what's not on the paper, because it can't be. You think you took my charity, took my water fight, took my 40 cows. You didn't take anything. You gave me a reason to climb a gate. You gave me an old woman to pull out of a fire. You gave me a fight worth losing 40 head over. You gave a dead man back the only thing that makes the days worth the trouble, which is something outside your own self that you'd burn for." I put my hand on the paper. "So this isn't me giving you a home out of pity. This is me giving you a home because you already made this place a home for the first time since Alina, and a man ought to own up to where he lives. I live in a home now. You built it. I'm just putting your name on the door where it's been written in everything but ink for 3 months already. That's all the paper does. It tells the truth that's already true." She couldn't speak. She put her face down and her hands on the table next to the paper and she wept. And this time I didn't go check a horse and I didn't sit still being a witness. This time I got up and came around the table and put my old arms around her shoulders, awkward. A man 6 years out of practice at touching another living soul. And she turned and held onto the front of my shirt with both fists the way she'd held the carpet bag, the way she'd held the dish towel, braced her whole life for the thing to be taken away, and held on instead. Held on to a thing that wasn't going to be taken, maybe for the first time in her life. And I held the woman a whole town called broken while she shook, and over her head, out the kitchen window, the November light came different than it does in March. And I thought of all the foolish things I'd written in that ledger about light, and how I'd finally, at 58, found somebody to be foolish at out loud. She lived out her life on that land. I'll tell you that much, so you're not left wondering, because there's enough wondering in this world. She buried me, eventually. I was old when she came, and I got older, the way it goes, and the hip one, and then the rest of me followed it the way the rest of you always follows the hip. And she buried me next to a leaner, which I'd asked for, and she put up a stone. And on the stone, I'm told, under my name and my dates. She had them carve 4 words. I never saw it. You don't see your own stone. But the man who carved it told it around the valley, and so I know, the way you know things about your own funeral that you weren't there for. It says he gave me a home. And then under that, smaller, because Marin Cole was honest even when honesty cost her, and she would not let a stone tell only half a truth any more than she'd let a town. I gave him one back. She kept the ledger going after I was gone. Foss told the lawyer who told the story, it gets around, that she never stopped writing in it. The feed prices and the calving dates and the foolish things about the light. And that she'd taken in, over the years, 2 other women the valley had decided were broken. A widow with nothing and a girl run off from a bad marriage, and given them corners and wages and a place to prove out. And that the ledger had got fuller and fuller and somehow lighter and lighter. The way it had started during the night, she found it square in the middle of my table and trusted me not to mind. Caleb Mercer, since you'll want to know, the world wants the small man to get his, and he mostly did, though not the loud way. His marriage to the Hollies girl came apart inside 2 years. The story Judge Halloran told in that crowded room never did stop being told. And the marshal got an anonymous letter some years on, about a hand named Pard Willis and a card debt, and a fall that wasn't a fall. And there was an inquiry, and it didn't quite catch him. These things rarely do, all the way, but it followed him the rest of his days like the dust comes up the road before the rider. And a man who has to live being followed by a thing like that is not, in the end, a man who won. I kept my promise about Pard Willis, you'll have noticed, the right way, someday, when it was his justice and not my weapon. Marin mailed the letter. I'd asked her to after I was gone, and she did, and that's the last thing the 2 of us did together, in a manner of speaking, gave a dead boy his due, the slow, honest way, the only kind of justice that doesn't cost you your soul to collect. I don't know how to end this. I never was good at ends. I left the ledger to a better writer than me. So I'll just tell you the last thing I have, which isn't a lesson, because Marin hated being made into a lesson, having spent 4 years as somebody's cautionary tale. It's just this. There was a woman, and a town called her broken, and wrote it down and made it law. And she walked 11 miles in a busted shoe to ask a stranger whether a person could be worth keeping if they couldn't give anybody anything. And the true answer, the one I didn't have that first night and have spent the rest of my life learning, the true answer is that the question was wrong from the start. It was the town's question. It was Caleb's question, and the reverend's and the mother's and her own dead father's. What can you give? As if a person were a field or a stove or a thing that earns its keep. She wasn't a field. She was the woman who grabbed my rein. And the home I gave her was never the land. The land was just the paper. The home was the thing we built in the gap where the world had told us both we were empty, 2 people who'd been declared worthless by people too small to weigh them, who climbed a gate together every day and made the cage into a joke, and pulled a heifer out of a wash and an old woman out of a fire, and proved a whole valley wrong not by arguing, but by simply, stubbornly, going on living like the valley's verdict didn't bind us. Because it didn't. That's the thing nobody tells you about a verdict. It only binds you if you sign. She never signed. Neither in the end did I. The light's coming different through the window now. October light. Eleanor would know the word for it. Marin would too.